Love the fact that he wanted to say hi to everybody, which really is a testament to his character, which reminds me of the story that you tell when you interviewed him in 2018 after he was battling brain cancer a couple years before, and you asked him about that experience and how he was thinking about death and the end of life. And you actually ended up having a pretty inspiring...
Because he was only given 2 or 3 weeks to live at that time before he got treatment, which reversed the condition. But he was thinking that, with just a couple of weeks to live, afterward, he was proud of the life he led. He would miss certain people he would leave behind, including, at the time, Rosalind Carter, who was alive. But he wasn't afraid of what came next. And he said, and I was surprised by that. But you talked about teach Sunday school. One of the amazing things is he spent at least another hour after church posing with each one of the parishioners who came to see him. People came from all over the world to this tiny church in Plains, and Jimmy Carter insisted on having his picture taken with all of them, just as he did when he built homes. So many people around the world, tens with you in the plane.
Yeah, it really is a testament to who he was and how he loved people, and how so many people talk about how honest he was too, something that we don't always find.
ABC News special report celebrating Jimmy.
Long national goodbye to former President Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, now beginning his final journey through the nation's capital. These images from just moments ago, Air Force One touching down there in Washington, his casket arriving at Joint Base Andrews aboard Special Air Mission. President Carter lying in repose since Saturday. Thousands, of course, turning out to pay their respects. President Carter dying at his home in Plains, Georgia on December 29th at the age of 100. Flags across the U.S. are half-staff in his honor. President Biden designating Thursday a national day of mourning when the funeral service for Jimmy Carter will be held at the National Cathedral. All surviving presidents are expected to attend, Capitol stopping first at the U.S. Navy Memorial. Jimmy Carter's life of public service beginning in the Navy. He graduated from the Naval Academy, serving on the USS Wyoming before becoming a submariner. His casket will be transferred to a horse-drawn caisson. He will then proceed to the Capitol. His casket carried up the steps into the Capitol Rotunda, where he will lie in state until his funeral on Thursday. He will be laid to rest near his home in Plains, Georgia, alongside former First Lady Rosalind Carter. Of course, his beloved wife of 77 years, who is in Georgia. He was the last to interview the Carters for us. Steve, that interview was so moving, and so are these images yet again today. Jimmy Carter making his final trip to Washington.
David, for president, we know that tens of thousands of people braved the cold through the night. The visitation here was open all day and all night. He was, in addition to all of his other accomplishments, a former peanut farmer. I think we're seeing people celebrate, of course, the leader he was, but also the student of the world that Jimmy Carter was, along with his wife and the love that they shared. When I talked with them in that final interview about the love that they shared and how it powered him through the White House, through the challenges of their lives at home, through the years that they spent trying to heal the world. And also, he said he passed, and his grandson told me that he had been checking in with his grandfather and saying that the former president was telling him that he wanted to go and see Rose, that it was time. And it was, of course, shortly after then that he passed. David.
Steve Wilson, South State's Jimmy Carter. For those of you just joining us now for our live coverage here on ABC, you can see the plane has touched down at Joint Base Andrews. It will now proceed to take Jimmy Carter on a procession through elected president back in 1976.
I think it's not lost on the viewers the symbolism of what we're seeing here, the snow-covered runway. It was, after all, a frigid reception. But I was thinking about, in his book, Why Not the Best, where he gave a long list of who he was, not a complete list, he reminded the reader. But he said, I'm a Southerner and an American. I'm a farmer, an engineer of Bob Dylan songs and Dylan Thomas's poetry. But I think among all of the many descriptors, today people are remembering him for his humility. Here's a guy who carried his own bags, even during his presidency, who refused to have "Hail to the Chief" play when he walked into a room, who sold the presidential yacht thinking that it was unnecessary after his presidency when he would famously fly. And so I do think that we will no doubt talk a lot about this peanut farmer turned president, but many people remember him for being this champion of human rights around the world.
No question about that, Lindsay. Relative unknown when he was swept, change for the American people after years of Watergate and the Vietnam War, but he would soon be tested with some very real challenges of his own. Of course, the economy, what we saw play out in his later years in the presidency, with a need to address the American people, to relate to them in very common terms, particularly during the energy crisis, for example, and during those trying times with the economy and inflation. 4 years, the American people would judge him harshly. But part of the story of Jimmy Carter is how he redefined the post-presidency moving forward, and the extraordinary amount of respect the American people have for this former president now when they look at the totality of not just the presidency, but certainly what he did post-presidency. I want to bring in Deborah Roberts, who is also from Georgia. We know that 40 minutes or so down the highway in Perry, Georgia, where you grew up. And you remember this. You remember what your father made of this moment for this Southerner who became president.
I absolutely do, David. And I have to tell you, I have to confess to a few tears today watching this, the president, the body being taken. And when I think about how he viewed this man and how the South viewed this man at the time, and it was very, very complicated. But my father saw something of himself in Carter, even though Carter was this white man who ascended to the presidency in the segregation of the South. Of course, Carter's life was a little bit different, but to see that man, as my father said, a good man from Georgia, make it to not only the governorship, but also the presidency, it was a source of pride of them.
Not only acknowledge it, but when he became governor of Georgia, in his inauguration, he said to the people of Georgia, we need to move forward on fire. And what do you see from your vantage point, Elizabeth?
David, the atmosphere here at Joint Base Andrews, somber, intimate, ahead of an arrival ceremony. As you can see, that plane typically known as Air Force One, now Special Air Mission 39 in honor of President Carter as the 39th President of the United States. As they prepare to unload his casket onto the hearse there, right there, a motorcade is lined up. Close friends and family here, a small ceremony, expecting music from the Air Force One band. But David, a moment truly to mark.
Special Air Mission 39. Elizabeth, thank you there. Joint Base Andrews, formerly known as Andrews Air Force Base, for those of you who remember it the way we used to call it years ago, and certainly back when Jimmy Carter was president. Beginning to disembark. Mary Jordan, talk about the pomp and circumstance for this former president. And Deborah Roberts and Lindsay Davis before, alluded to this, that he didn't need those. I don't need the salute. A lot of that has returned. But on this day, and lying in state, and the power of this moment, this is something that Jimmy Carter appreciated.
Oh my gosh, he was so proud that he was a son of the South that had become president. And he was he knew all the details that was coming down here. I think and he called the head of the Carter Center and he said, oh my God, there are people around the block. They want to see me. They want to sign a book. They want to talk to me. He would be just so happy that people of every political party, said, job well done. Thank you for caring about human rights, poverty, global health around the world. He was really proud of what he did after he left the White House.
Long-lived, well-lived, and in service to this country.
He used the words a couple of years ago, grateful. I'm grateful that people are happy that I chose public service until the very, very end. I'm grateful, he said.
Mary gathered for this powerful moment, Mary.
Yes, there's the 3 sons, and then there was a 15-year gap, and then along came Amy, who many people remember was only 9 when she went to the White House. So Jack is the oldest, and the son of the man who died here is 77. 4 children, his 11 grandchildren, his 14 great-grandchildren, big Carter family, and a close close family that spent a lot of time with him as he's been in hospice for almost 2 years.
When he was elected back in '76 on Inauguration Day, actually getting out of the car on Pennsylvania Avenue, few will remember that he was the first, he and Rosalind Carter, to get out to walk.
And, you know, a lot of people have tried to imitate it, even though the Secret Service doesn't like it anymore for security reasons. But he wanted to be a man of the people. And he said, you know, don't play hail to the chief. Just wave to me and call me Jimmy. In fact, he was the only president who, when he took his oath of office, said Jimmy.
Let's listen here for a moment at Andrews Air Force Base, Force Base Andrews. Joint Base Andrews, you can see they're preparing for the ceremony here. The former president's body will be brought off of the 39th president. The Special Honor Guard obviously moving into position here. This is the level of audio they're delivering to us from Joint Base Andrews. If you're listening at home with us, this is as clearly as we can hear it. We're expecting at any moment here that the family will disembark from the aircraft. They'll move into position, it's our belief, to then observe the arrival ceremony themselves. And the ceremonial troops will present arms and render honors there. For a former president who would, as Mary said during the inauguration, call himself Jimmy and do away with some of the trappings, the official trappings of the presidency. Today he will get, obviously, a 21-gun salute, hail to the chief, and what you would expect as a nation honors a former. Martha Raddatz watching with us here today. And Martha, this was a former president very proud of his military service.
He was so proud of his military service, David. He said it was the most influential thing in his life. He wanted to be in the Navy since he was in the and was set on a career in the Navy. He even wrote the Naval Academy when he was a young man, not telling them his age at the time, and asked what you had to do to get into the Naval Academy. He did not get in the first Marines. As you said, he was a submariner, a submariner. They pronounce it either way, but he adored service in the Navy. Rosalind, his wife, loved her husband being in the Navy, and he was very reluctant to leave in 1953, and so influential for him.
Mary, you can see the Carter family now joining here. As you mentioned, 4 children, 11 grandchildren, 14 great-grandchildren. There's the family right there. And of course, they lost their mother a couple of years back. 77 years they were married, he and Rosalind. And they both said sort of the secret to their longevity was one another.
It was very moving when Chip Carter, who's the second oldest, said yesterday, he said, you know, it was hard at times. We had to share our parents with the world. They were busy. You know, we didn't see them all. And it was a blessing, as Chip Carter said. I was so grateful that he lived so long, that we had wonderful, wonderful times. He also told a great story about flunking at Jimmy Carter, read the textbook, and then became his tutor. And then he retook the test and got an A.
That's an extraordinary story. And of course, we remember Amy, who did grow up in the public eye at the White House. Her dad putting the treehouse on the south lawn of the White House that she would famously play in with friends.
Reading books at the dinner table. Remember, there were like some very fancy dinners, but the poor kid was 9. It was not the easiest thing to be 9, 10 growing up there. She went to public school, which many public school add put them in a fancy private school. I want her to go to a public school.
And I believe her best friend was the child of a cook for one of the embassies in Washington, and the Carter family very proud of that too. I'm moved as we wait for this ceremony to begin, Deborah, by how many images here today we've been showing in the West Wing.
The first to do that, David, actually. And that was the thing about him. He was a trailblazer in so many ways. Came from humble beginnings, but
That's
helping...
Lillian Carter you're
Lillian
talking about,
Carter,
right? Yeah.
yes. His mother went on to help African-American women in the South. So he came from a family that would sort of step away from what was expected and blaze new trails, and that's kind of what we remember him for. I spoke with a former legislator today for things. He changed things in Georgia and certainly changed things a lot in Washington. Not always, you know, he was not always embraced, but he certainly was all about change.
Jimmy Carter's mother, Lillian, in her 60s, began a new chapter with the Peace Corps. I mean, this is a very interesting off with the farm, but they were a family that would push the envelope, if you will, and push their community to be open to embracing everyone before much of the South was willing to do so.
That's exactly right. All about morality, and that was very important to him, that moral fiber. Jimmy Carter was willing to sort of cut a new fish and learn to speak fluent Spanish by reading the Spanish version of the Bible. This was a man, while he came across as a very simple man from the South, but who just had broad horizons and really sort of opened up his life and the life of those around him to, you know, just see the world differently.
He was a born-again Christian self with the language. In talking about Lillian, before we move forward here, there's a great story as well about how when there were discussions in the family that Jimmy Carter first wanted to run for president, she said, "President of what?" Lynn and those closest to him decided that this is what they were going to do. They set out to methodically work the Democratic establishment at the time, up against, remember, Teddy Kennedy at the time and others who would challenge art. But the whole Democratic establishment to earn his way. He had a sense that there was an opening for someone like him.
He did. I mean, it was an audacious thing. He was not considered anything near a front runner or even one of the top tier candidates at first. What he did, David, is he really was the first to put the Iowa caucuses on the map. The Iowa caucuses were there, and he went and basically moved to Iowa. He spent his time win that upset victory as the Democratic nominee. I got to tell you, watching this, watching him come in, you know, on the plane in his he was certainly by no means the most successful president. His presidency was a troubled, short 4 years. But we never had a president who would go on to live for 100 years out of the White House. And so much of what we will be talking about and remembering Jimmy Carter for is what he did after he left 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. In of freedom, he said, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter have done more good things for more people in more places than any other couple on the face of ex-president of the United States.
Well said, John. Mary Bruce, our chief White House correspondent, and Mary, President Biden, the first president to travel back to Plains, Georgia, and he did so with Georgia to honor, if you will, Jimmy Carter and his decades of service long beyond the presidency.
And they had a decades-long relationship, David. And look, there are lots of people with lots of relationships in Washington, but this was a real friendship, not just a political relationship. Yes, Joe Biden was actually the first senator at the time to endorse Jimmy Carter's long-shot bid many, many years ago. And out of that, they formed this real deep friendship. And it wasn't just between, you know, the two former presidents. It was between these couples, between Jill Biden, Joe Biden, and Rosalind and Jimmy Carter as well. And you heard from the president, you know, in his remarks since his passing, noting that he wasn't just a president, a humanitarian, a statesman, but a dear, dear friend. And going beyond that to say that he knows that millions of others in the way in which he truly redefined the post-presidency, but he was able to really relate to people on a human level because he was so no frills, no nonsense, that down his eulogy this Thursday at the service at the National Cathedral, David.
Mary, thank you. That image of the Bidens with the Carters in Plains, Georgia, Mary, and I think it was the Washington Post that pointed out the home is valued at about $167, which to me speaks volumes about the Carters.
It's so true. I mean, when you're in their kitchen, it's a tiny little fridge, and you know he was famous for not wasting food. So he had a cooler for leftovers in Tupperwares. You know, when he had a big family, and you can see out there all of this family, they'd come, and I mean it was.
And Steve Osunsami to go back to that home after the presidency and stay there all those years, and we know what presidents can make post-presidency with books and speaking. But they had a different purpose, and they chose to return to their humble roots in Plains.
It's one of the things that so many people love about Jimmy Carter, that he never forgot where he came from, that he loved his wife always, that he lived what I call, heard from some family members over the years, is how they would try often to get the Carters to replace old appliances. They had an old microwave that the family thought at the Carter Center, for example. You know, we talk about you talked about the house that the Carters lived in, how small it was. My house is bigger than their house. The center that sits above it, where the Secret Service uses, is bigger. They were everyday people in many
here today in America. motorcade beginning to leave Joint Base Andrews there as it makes its final trip through Washington. We know the family has now gotten into the motorcade, getting ready to depart the flight line for the U.S. Navy Memorial, where they will head next. And Ann Compton, longtime ABC White House correspondent, and no question you're taking note of a very different arrival in Washington from the one Jimmy Carter had all those years ago.
Kind of president. He wanted to be something totally new to the country, which had been through the long, arduous years of the Watergate scandal. There had been President Richard Nixon's dissent over the war. And he really, when he arrived in Washington, one of the things he wanted to do was to make a real break and a new start for the country. And the kind of issues he wanted, certainly right to the people's level, so many of the policies, main concern when he got to Washington was energy. There were long lines for gasoline, there was inflation, there was a very difficult time for the economy. And he set about to make energy the starring role of his first year in office. It took a lot of work. He wasn't completely successful, but he really did wanted his arrival in Washington to clear the decks and change the course, and get away from some of the pomp and circumstance, which in a case long time planned symbol to honor not only his career, but what he wanted to achieve as the 39th president.
And thank you. Wonderful to have you here today through the course of this afternoon. Terry Moran also watching along with us. And even after all of these decades, he's still somewhat of an outsider in the way that he defined the post-presidency so different from every other president in modern times.
Yeah, that's a great point, David. He was the ultimate outsider. Nobody had ever heard of him who were Washington insiders, right? Gerald Ford had been minority leader of the House of Representatives. Richard Nixon had been around since the 1940s. And Lyndon Johnson was the Senate Majority Leader. The country was in a fraught state, as Ann was talking. The person of Jimmy Carter, the American voters who elected him narrowly, were finding in part those old American virtues that we've been talking about as perhaps a solution to the problems of the melody. His ordinariness, that walk down Pennsylvania Avenue, they seemed so normal walking down Pennsylvania Avenue. And I think that was a strength of his political character. He struggled to succeed in the presidency because Washington was still a very insular place. And he couldn't find a way to work at values and those goals. And I think we say goodbye to him, the country does, in admiration for the 44 years since he left office.
An extraordinary run post-presidency, dying at the age of 100, the oldest living president, losing Rosalind not long ago after 77 years of marriage. As we watch the motorcade there leave Joint Base Andrews this afternoon, we're also joined by presidential historian Mark Updegrove. And Mark, in going back through so much of what we put together, I was struck by a quote that actually the former president gave, and he offered it to the public in such a matter-of-fact way, the news. And in fact, just days later, he showed up at Sunday school to teach his normal Sunday school class. And I just wanted to remind you, Mark, and you probably don't need reminding, but of the quote that he gave to you. He said, "I wasn't afraid or particularly sorrowful, except that I would see the people I love, wouldn't see the people I love anymore. But I didn't have any feeling of resentfulness or fear." And I was surprised by that. The former president sort of glean here is that he was in hospice care for 2 years. He was put into hospice. We all wondered if the end was getting very close and he would survive 2 more years with his family, Mark.
When he was diagnosed with melanoma on the brain in 2015 and was given 2 weeks to live. And that's what he was talking about with that quote. He was thinking about imminent death at that time. He ended up undergoing treatment which prevented death. But the amazing thing, David, and it speaks to Carter's legacy, is I talked to President Carter about that diagnosis. He only expected to live for 3 weeks, and yet he looked at that and she thought, well, he's finally going to slow down. And we can take in the days ahead and accept what is coming before us. But he decided, upon looking work up until the very end, because all of those projects meant so much to him And of course, they mean so much to his legacy as well, David.
Mark Updegrove with us here this afternoon as well. Martha, as I mentioned, the motorcade now headed for the U.S. Navy Memorial. 19 years old, did not reveal his true age in the very beginning. It took him a couple of tries. Wife Rosalind was also very proud. In fact, when it was time, Jimmy Carter believed, to move on from their service to the Navy, she was somewhat upset by that because she was so proud of the relationship they had forged with their naval peers.
Exactly, David. And I think one of the reasons she wanted to leave is because of it's very difficult. When he first went on a submarine, the Pomfret out of Pearl Harbor, his first real deployment on the Pomfret, there was a terrible, terrible storm one night. And she was back in Plains, Georgia, which he said he was very grateful for later, because he was actually washed off to save himself and get back on that submarine. But for days in Pearl Harbor, the spouses didn't know if their husbands had survived. Rosalind Carter had no idea they'd even lost comms because she wasn't in Pearl Harbor. Obviously, that ship was okay, that submarine was okay, but she still loved that life. I think Jimmy Carter said that's one of the few big arguments they had when he wanted to leave Navy service and return home after the death of his father. And as we watch that car and that procession heading for Washington, D.C., you're there at the Navy Memorial. It is a very important place to Jimmy Carter, to the Carter family, and to his legacy. I talked this morning to the Secretary of the Navy, a man named Carlos Del Toro, who I've known for many, many, many years. He was a former naval officer, and he was so full of stories about Jimmy Carter, how much he meant to him as a young naval officer just before he entered hospice. And he went down to see him, spent about an hour there. He said he was completely lucid. He was very frail. He said he was covered by a blanket opinions about Russia, gave him his opinions about China. And the Secretary of the Navy was able to tell President Carter that the Naval Academy would soon be naming a building, changing the name of a building to honor President Carter. It had been an electrical submarine has been named for you, but that's not going to be around forever. This building will be around forever. It will bear your name. He said the president teared up when he heard that. It meant so much to him to have that legacy at the Naval Academy and in the Navy, David.
Yeah, that was extraordinary when you shared that story earlier today, Martha. And again, just for our audience at home, the Secretary of the Navy offering that piece of information to the former President Jimmy Carter. This was right before he went into hospice. So this was very late in life that he learned that not only the submarine that had been named in work speaks volumes about why they decided to name this particular building, and that the former president certainly understood the meaning of that.
He understood what that meant, and that really captured Jimmy Carter's life, his whole life, but especially his life in the Navy. He was an electrical engineer. He went out on those submarines. He also tells this amazing story of how President Carter once met with Hyman Rickover. He's the father of the nuclear Navy. And Hyman Rickover was interviewing young Lieutenant Carter. And one of the last questions Rickover asked him was, "Do you always do your best?" And Jimmy Carter was very nervous, and he said, "Well, I don't always do my best." And Rickover stared at him. Carter was sweating, and he said, "Why don't you?" And that stuck with Jimmy Carter. Why don't you? I should do
this country, and then right into the mid-Atlantic, the East Coast, the terrible ice storm, the snowstorm, and then look at what the skies have done for Jimmy Carter today, the 39th president, as he arrives back to the Washington, D.C. area. Nothing but blue skies. And obviously, as you can see, they've been able to clear the roads for the motorcade as it makes its way into Washington, D.C. The Naval Memorial, of course, on the way to the Capitol. Pastor Tony Loudon, personal pastor to the Carter family, to the former president, is obviously behind the former president as part of this motorcade.
It's an incredible day, a day where we bring the Sunday school teacher back to Washington, D.C., who has given us a lesson on faith and hope all over again, making sure that we use faith and hope as our guardrails for our democracy. I'm really excited about the fact that it gets to be honored during this time, and seeing so many people turn out and talk about the life and legacy of my friend, President Carter.
Pastor Loudon, if you will, some of the lessons perhaps from Jimmy Carter later in life for the American people. You know, we talked moments ago about his health scares, certainly very real, the brain cancer that he fought so valiantly and then was declared 7 years. Rosalind, going into hospice himself. And as I mentioned, Pastor Loudon, on our air earlier, we all wondered if perhaps we were nearing the end of this grand life. And then he would again surprise us all with the power of his faith. He would survive 2 more years, and his family would get 2 more years with their father and their grandfather.
Every time I would visit him, he would ask me 4 questions. Where have you been? What have you done? Who have you helped? And how can I help you help them? Even during his roughest times, sometimes I would walk in the room and he was really doing bad or having a rough day. He would just say, where have you been? Knowing that I would give him a full detail. And then the part where he asked, how can I help you help them? It just would break me on the inside. That here in his latter days, he's still trying to find a way to give himself to our great nation and the world.
Pastor Loudon, what a gift you just shared with us, and if you can, I help you help them. Pastor Loudon, please stay with us here as you travel with the motorcade. Lindsay Davis, part of the lessons of President Carter in his final decades of public service, not only the work with Habitat for Humanity and trying to eradicate disease all over the world and what he did for humanitarian reasons, but the way he quietly and faithfully lived his life with his wife and his community.
So many know him, obviously, for teaching Sunday school after his presidency, but he has also talked about, in reflecting on his earlier life, that he said, without letting the press know, several times a year he would actually teach Sunday school while he was president. And there is a quote that he said, at one point he said, I have not as many have, that he was an outsider. But I think that he was an outsider with no interest really in being an insider so much, because he was ruled more by his faith than he was by his politics. And I was struck by what the pastor said just a moment ago with regard to one of the questions that he largely black town. He talked about how his childhood friends were black, and there was a black friend of his who, just before he was becoming governor of Georgia, he said to that friend, how can I help you? And his friend wrote down, he said, when you give your inaugural in Georgia is over. Words that he would repeat ultimately again nearly 5 decades later in 2020 in the wake of George Floyd's death, where he wasn't obviously specific to Georgia, but just saying simply the time for racial discrimination is over. And at the time, it was a shock, really, to many of the people who had supported him in Georgia, because he had remained silent on civil rights by design. It was really a strategy because he had lost the governorship, the race for governor in Georgia right before that. But what an ally he became.
More women and people of color than any of his predecessors arriving at the White House before him. And I wonder, Pastor Loudon, if you could weigh in on that, too, about the combination of faith and what the former president did to make sure that people of color, that women had a seat at the table, and that all members of our community felt heard and felt seen in a way where he really made strides in the presidency.
And, I'm also reminded that I'm a son of a slave descendant who ended up being his pastor. Today, as we were leaving Georgia, there was a white sailor seaman who was holding the flag and showed that we had strength. And then when we got to D.C., there was an African-American seaman holding that exact same flag, fighting against the winds to make sure that our nation has a solid foundation representing the celebration of life of President Carter. I thought it was so fitting in this flag to make sure that our nation honored this great leader. Rachel Clark, a black woman who helped raise the children, a sharecropper, lived on the farm where Jimmy Carter was raised. She would teach him about Christ and how to treat a family and love your family. Bishop William Jesus Christ. I'll never forget one Saturday he took me and myself and Secret Service out to Archery, Georgia, to an unmarked grave site. And there he pointed to the headstone of Bishop William Decker Bonner. and told me what an impact this man had on his life. And then he looked over to the right and he showed me a tombstone that had on all the impacts that African Americans have had in this great nation. I'm so excited that God has brought him home to a place where we can say that there's no segregation in heaven, where he'll be on display so that he can fight against discrimination in this nation.
Pastor
I
Loudon,
just
we're
want to
looking
thank
at
everyone out there.
Yeah, we're looking at images of you with the Carters right now as you thank the American people who are watching. And I'll let you finish that sentiment, and I'll only tack on a bit of a question to it, though, if I could, Pastor, which is, as you know, we are in very divided times in this country, and there's no sort of one moment that will solve that, but perhaps moments like the one that we're witnessing by the news reports, the articles that I've read about this sort of long road home back through Washington before he goes back home again, the kinds of people who've lined the route, the way that he was even more so after the presidency able to bring Americans together. There can be a lot learned from that, Pastor.
As I've traveled around the country fighting for criminal justice reform, I've had Republicans come up to me and whisper, "How's the president doing?" I've had independents come up to me and say, "How's the president doing?" Driving through Southwest Georgia, getting to the place where we are celebrating his life, there was folks in rural communities that we know were red communities lined the streets with their flags and saluting the casket as it went by. You know, whether it's high income or low income, we all want to believe, as President Carter put in his speech in 1979, a crisis in confidence, that we have confidence in our nation, that no matter how many times we have elections, that we'll come together for the greater good, because we swear in our servant leaders who put their left hand on the Bible and raise their right hand to make a commitment to owe glory. And we use faith and hope. President Carter was all about. He wanted to make sure that we had a nation that would recognize those who are downtrodden, those who may need water, clean water overseas in Africa. He really gave us his best. I can say now that we can answer that question that Admiral Rickover asked him, why you didn't give your best. We can tell him today that President Jimmy Carter gave America and the world his
left-hand side of your screen there. This is ABC News Live coverage as a country celebrates a former president, the 39th president of the United States, Jimmy Carter, making his final trip into Washington, D.C. He will stop at the U.S. Navy Memorial. And as we've talked about here this afternoon, the former president was extraordinarily proud of his early days in the U.S. Navy, his family farm, the peanut farm, and then dive into politics. And as I mentioned earlier in our coverage, first state senator, then he tried for governor, did not win the first time, eventually was successful. And when he broke the news to the rest of the family, Lillian, his mother, his outspoken mother, said, "President of what you want to be?" And he was off. He began his campaign for the presidency in a time in America when the people of this country were hungry for change, and we've seen that so many times in modern politics, different eras in this country. Democrat from the South, for an outsider, for somebody who was not going to show up and deliver politics as usual. And how many times have we heard that? But tried to pass so many policies and proposals that he had. Some said that he bit off more than he could chew, and then he certainly was handed crises that he had to address. The Iran hostage crisis, the final year of his presidency, the energy crisis, inflation, which he was elected on to try to fix the economy, and then was saddled with a very difficult economy during his 4 years as well. Ronald Reagan winning in 1980, both on the economy, obviously, as a major issue, and bringing the Americans home, which, as you know, Jimmy Carter learned of in the final hours of his presidency. And it wasn't until actually after the inauguration that those Americans actually came home. And Martha Raddatz, you've traveled to Iran, so have I. So you've been there so often. You've visited. What was he spoke in many of his writings about looking at himself in the mirror in those final hours of the presidency, wondering, have I really aged this much, or am I simply exhausted given I have not slept? That he was determined to get those hostages freed in the end.
He certainly was, David. And during those years, those 444 days that the 53 American hostages were held, you could see it on Jimmy Carter's face. You could see the pain. You could see how much attention he was paying to that. And then, of course, the tragic loss of life of 8 service members who were trying to rescue those hostages, that failed rescue attempt when the hostages were finally freed. And you can just feel that history. You can feel Jimmy Carter's history, the pain of that. For many, many years, they see as a symbol of loss. During the nuclear agreement period, the joint nuclear agreement period, they took it down. The Iranians took it down and they put it in the back. And I could see it in the back. And I thought that was so symbolic as well. But that was something that pained Jimmy Carter till the end. I assume he thought about it a lot in the last hour or so, but that was something that stayed with Jimmy Carter. He didn't think about it in political terms. He didn't think, oh, darn, I lost because for Jimmy Carter's remains into that caisson, which will be an incredibly moving point. And that, again, as you said, David, is at that Navy memorial that he authorized to be built because the Navy meant so much to him.
He did. He chose the United States Navy Memorial as the site of transfer when planning his funeral procession through Washington. Martha Raddatz, thank you for being here this afternoon, and we'll come back to you again shortly. You're looking at the motorcade as it travels into Washington and preparations at the U.S. Navy Memorial for that transfer, that deeply moving moment. Mark Updegrove, a presidential historian, just to sort of finish the point on Iran, because so many Americans count how many days have the hostages been held in Iran.
You're absolutely right, David. Day 21, day 59, day 352. It went on and on and on and had a drip effect on the Carter administration. But it also bears mentioning that while it really crippled the Carter presidency, Carter was determined to see to the release of those 52 hostages, and he did on the couch in the Oval Office, but he was there to ensure their release, and indeed they were released on the last day of his presidency. A last thumb in his eye, the Iranians released the hostages. They left Iranian airspace just after Ronald Reagan took the presidency. But Jimmy Carter, on what may have been the most humiliating day of his life, relinquishing the presidency to Ronald Reagan after failing to be reelected, talked about that as the happiest day of his life because those 52 Americans were released, David.
Isn't that extraordinary, Mary Jordan? It's just a moment in history, certainly, that we all do remember. But to know that deeply personal moment, he was giving up the presidency, but as Mark points out, it was his most sort of fulfilled moment of the presidency, too, is that he was able to get those Americans freed in the very, very end. And I've read in going back that he'd reached out to the president-elect Ronald Reagan, who did not take the call that morning to inform him that I've learned that the hostages will be released. And of course, we know the timing of it. It didn't officially happen until the new president was sworn in. But to think he was giving up the presidency, he had been defeated by Ronald Reagan, who ran a very smart and difficult campaign to compete with, given the economy and what was playing out in Iran. And in fact, he talked about making America great again back in leading up to the 1980 election. But to think that personally, in those very quiet moments in the final hours of the presidency for
with him, and he said, you know, I think in hindsight, I was too consumed. I was paralyzed. All I could think of were each of those hostages, each of their families. It was hard to sleep. What he had done. And then he said, a lot of people come down here, you know, I'm struck, from Washington to talk to me about how to handle pressure like this. like when you're in the presidency or you're running a big Senate committee. I mean, the pilgrimage down to Jimmy Carter is amazing. I was there when Bill Clinton came not too long ago, and I said to former President Clinton, what did you talk about with Jimmy? And he said, well, you know, I was in the presidency, we didn't really talk about, there's something to be said for sticking. But whether it was a stressful thing like how to handle a world crisis, hostages, a war, or marriage, Nancy Pelosi was down there. Pete Buttigieg was. Over the last several years, quietly, an enormous number of well-known people in Washington came down to Plains, Georgia, where this motorcade started, to just say either thank you or to ask some advice.
To ask advice from someone who had lived many, many decades post the presidency. And as we're watching the motorcade get closer to the U.S. Navy Memorial in Washington, we think about that Biden who did so in a very public manner with First Lady Jill Biden. They were determined as sitting president and sitting First Lady to travel home to Plains, Georgia, Jimmy Carter's home and Rosalind Carter, to honor them in a very public way and to acknowledge their service in all these decades since the presidency. Our chief Washington correspondent again.
And hearing of the pilgrimage down to Plains and all of those leaders who came to pay their respects and to have one last conversation with Jimmy Carter and to see this now play out. After he left the presidency, in fact, you mentioned Joe Biden, Joe Biden, the president in all those years. He didn't have particularly close relationships with any of his successors until Joe Biden. He had a very close relationship with his predecessor, interestingly, Gerald Ford, but he was not part of the former president's club. He went in an entirely different direction, which was fitting with how he came to Washington in the first place. You know, there's a great quote from Jimmy Carter where, you know, during the campaign, he said, "I've been accused of being an outsider. I plead, you know, shifting group of insiders that take over from, you know, one party or another takes over." He was a breath of fresh air from the outside, somebody with really no Washington experience, somebody who his big first promise was a very simple one: "I will never lie to you. I will never lie to you."
John Carl with us here as you get there, which is the real challenge facing so many of the leaders of our time. Martha Raddatz, every president gets to decide whether to have a procession like
this hearse to stop in front of the Navy Memorial. Look at all those midshipmen lined up. Look at all those naval officers lined up to honor President Carter. It is a beautiful spot there in Washington. I know you have been there as well, David, the one he authorized to be built. Hero is there. He told me this morning that he would be there by 1:30 and that it was such an honor and a blessing to get to know President Carter during his time as Secretary of the Navy. He also told me that on his 100th birthday, on Jimmy Carter's 100th birthday, the Secretary of the Navy thought, what do you do for Jimmy Carter? And he had an F-18 flyover for President Carter. President Carter stood there with his children, his grandchildren, and watched those grand airplanes fly above him and to remember his own Navy service. He actually learned how to fly a plane while in the Navy with supervision, they say.
Washington. Again, the former president requesting this. And we've talked often here this afternoon about so much of the fanfare that he sort of passed over. This was an honor that he was hoping he would receive. This is the U.S. Army's 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard. The lead horses here, Rocket and Burns, members of the U.S. Navy lined up. prepared to pay their respects to the former president, 39, his service to his country. The former president chose the U.S. Navy Memorial as the site of this transfer when planning his own funeral. Martha mentioned this, but he authorized the building, the United States Navy Memorial Plaza, the Visitor Center. That's, of course, on Pennsylvania Avenue for anyone who's made the trip to Washington, D.C. Quite remarkable. And these are one of those moments meant to bring the country together, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, and sort of a reminder of the respect we have for President of the United States. You can see the flags there at half staff, as they are across the nation, to honor the 39th president. 100 that in recent days, while still in hospice, he started to indicate to his close loved ones that it was time to go see Rosalind.
Wanting to see his Rose. She died in November of 2023. There were many of us who knew and the family well and knew his relationship with his wife, how important she was. But he pressed on. We talk a lot about the strength of this man and how much he persevered, the long life he lived. When I talked with both, just reading the Bible together at night, that was something that they tried to do every night, that they tried to do something every day, and that's how they made their relationship last. And so when she passed, there were so many of us who were watching very carefully, was determined to be there to say goodbye here in Atlanta at her funeral services in front of heads of states from around the world. As you know, he famously had a new suit made for him because the suit that he had didn't fit. So they tailored, and here they are now together again.
Determined to be there to pay his respects to Rosalind Carter. And Steve, it was you who asked that question the final time. What was the secret to their long and deep, deep bond? Martha Raddatz, when you look at the young faces of the midshipmen of the Naval Academy who will flank the memorial here, their faces to the side, you have to think that the former president would have been so
young officers and enlisted, and it makes me think of Wesley Brown. He was the 6th black midshipman at the Naval Academy, but the first to graduate. And he gave some credit to life at the Naval Academy. Wesley Brown has now passed away several years ago. But again, I heard today talking to several people how much Jimmy Carter meant to him because he truly cared. He truly helped them. And those were very, very difficult days for black midshipmen. But look at those faces today. That is a diverse Navy, a diverse military. Jimmy Carter, very proud of that.
We're about to witness the casket being removed from the hearse. Ceremonial troops will then present arms and render honors to the family. And then the former president will be brought to the Capitol. Much of this, in addition to the honors by the U.S. Navy, which so deeply moved the former president as he was planning the funeral that they would be willing to do this for him, given his early years in the Navy. But the rest of this procession from here on out is meant to sort of remind the country, if you will, of what they did as the family, as a family arriving in Washington before. There you see those images today. We'll talk with members of the family in a moment as the procession continues. But we're going to listen even more closely here. You can see the hearse arriving with the former president, Jimmy Carter. The U.S. Navy band has assembled. Family members will also disembark and will gather to watch their father and grandfather be honored before the nation today. His grandchildren and great-grandchildren honor the U.S. Navy. And as so many of our contributors have pointed out here this afternoon, that Jimmy Carter, when he was president, often did not require them to perform well to the chief. But this was an honor that he did ask for. And one that he often, about how proud they were of those early years in the U.S. Navy. And as Martha pointed out earlier, it wasn't easy for Rosalind Carter either as they began their family as well. But they were moved and shaped by those times. Mary, we're looking at members of the Carter family, his oldest son, Jack, there arriving with other members of the family. You can see the children and the grandchildren there.
Yes, he has 3 sons in their 70s, and Amy, who's in her 50s, and then, of course, all of the younger grandchildren. You know, Jimmy Carter survived one of his grandchildren. One of them died before he did, grandchildren, and then he has great-grandchildren there. It's a big day for them. They just didn't always like him, and they're gratified. There's one of his sons who's a little stooped over there. They were businessmen. Most of them work in Carter legacy.
Jimmy Carter also, many years ago, had outlived his own siblings, and they died of pancreatic cancer, a number of them.
Isn't that stunning?
It is.
He had 3 siblings, and all 3 died young of pancreatic cancer. He said was working on that in Africa and in other countries was to try to stop tobacco use because of what he saw in his own family.
that was his belief.
That was his belief, and who knows what it was, but
Sure.
that was one of the drivers. You know, he really believed in physical fitness and treating your body well. He swam until a few years ago. He had to be lifted into the pool by the years old.
Hey! Forward, push on, arm! Ready, step! Hey. Walk on! March. Ready, set. Ready, up. Ready. Step. Left about. Forward. Ready. Step.
Of course, the dignity of this moment for the house just 9 when they arrived, and Martha, the power of this moment, not only for the former president, but for his family watching on, for an honor he earned over many decades.
Beautiful. The dignity, the power, the honor, these ceremonies are meant to unify our country, to share grief, pride, and patriotism, David.
Not been part of sort of the public eye. She had a taste of that early in her life and has been content not to have that for the rest of her life.
She went to art school, children's book, and she said it was a wonderful thing. And then she moved to Atlanta, and she was making that 3-hour drive back and forth for the last few years.
Gifts, extra time with their father, who is being honored in front of the U.S. Navy Memorial now, after having lived to 100 years old.
As you watch this, and of course it's such a solemn period, but it's also, I can tell, just a moment of great pride for Southerners to see this son of the South given the respect that many felt that he never really got. And I spoke with a legislator today who worked with him. Of course, that left him pretty unpopular. And then he leaves Washington pretty unpopular, and many felt that he never really got his due. And Larry Walker, that former Democratic Majority Leader, said to me today, it's so nice to see, while it may be late in coming, Carter is getting his due, and he will go down in history as one of the best presidents of this country. And I think that that is something that is being felt not only around the country, but particularly in the South today.
What's so interesting, David, I was struck by the contrast in the music that we just heard back to back that the band played. They started out, of course, with Hail to the Chief and then went to Just As I Am Without One. Exuded both of them, perhaps in equal part in some ways. Just As I Am Without One Plea, of course, a very popular hymn. It was back in 1986 that the Carters started meeting with a task force to plan these 8 days. Everything that we're seeing with regard to the locations where they stop, the songs that are being played, the guests who are in attendance, the manner that he wanted us to see it today.
You speak of them helping to plan this in the mid-'80s. He would have been in his mid-60s then, because, or about 60-ish. He left the presidency in his mid-50s. Very young man. Had many decades to continue to define and shape what it was he was going to give to his country. And you can see the sun setting there on the day in Washington, on a southern... As the funeral procession begins now, I want to bring in a member of the Carter family who we're lucky enough to have with us here this afternoon. Kim Fuller is Jimmy Carter's niece. And Kim, I know you were there, similar trip as to what we all witnessed as a nation for Inauguration Day. A very powerful return, I'm sure, for you, and one that is so deserved.
Not quite as cold, I think, as it is up there right now, but it was very cold. And I can remember my daddy as we were standing in the review stands when the family got out of the vehicles and started walking. My daddy went, "Oh my word, what is he about to do?" But just a very fitting return from Uncle.
Gave to the country by getting out and waving to the American people who had lined the route. And what do you think the other main lesson from your uncle would be for the American people? Because as we've been told, not just with the presidency, and perhaps even more so with the decades of service to this country after the presidency, what would you like the lasting lesson to be of your uncle's life?
I think the lasting lesson I would like for people to see is the fact that Uncle Jimmy was someone who, what you saw was who he was. He was not afraid, strong, and I know that's what's carried him to 100, is that particular faith. And I would love for the world to know him as a simple man from South Georgia who sometimes did things and said things people didn't like, but he did it in.
Traveling that very same route he did back in 1977 on Inauguration Day. What does this moment mean for you?
Well, it's a very surreal moment. He has fought the good fight, and he has lived a long and faith-filled life, and I am so, so proud. And I know that right now he's up there with Daddy and Grandma and Aunt Rose, everybody else, and he's up there and he's looking down and he's going, "Don't want all this fuss," but he deserves it every single moment.
Don't want all this fuss, but presidential campaigns are difficult for every family. When he did not win re-election, I'm certain there was no doubt in your mind that he was going to find a way to define those future years after the presidency in a way that would help remind people what his hopes were for the country.
Yes, you're right. You know, it was very, very hard when he did not win that second time, and when he came home, it was raining, and people were just lining the streets and crying, but I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was going to do something really great. He'd already done it. He had a wheel that just kind of went out ahead.
And Kim, before we let you go, we wanted to thank you here at ABC News for taking a little bit of this very private, personal moment for you and your family to share this with us. And I'm just curious, because everyone knows that a huge part of Jimmy Carter's story was his love story with Rosalind. And what do you make of your aunt and uncle back together again?
They're holding hands. They are sitting right next to each other. And he was ready. He missed her so, so much. And I am so glad that they're back together again. Kim
Fuller, former President Jimmy Carter's niece, joining us on behalf of the family here today. Kim, thanks so much. To hear from Kim about the pain all those years ago when a family witnessed their loved one try to win the presidency a second term but did not. but then go on to demonstrate in ways that we had not seen before what a post-presidency in America can look like. Post-presidency of giving, of humanity, of faith, devotion to his church, his community, going home to Plains, Georgia. We have seen other presidents define their time after the presidency in many different ways, but this one was one of humility, one of returning to his humble roots. Let's listen to the root here for a moment, and we'll join Mary Bruce in a moment here. Mary Bruce, I know people supporting, remembering, reflecting on Jimmy Carter have begun to gather at the Capitol.
They have, David. We are starting to see some members of the public here, well bundled up members of the public here out in the snow, hoping to catch a glimpse of today's events. The honor guard is also now Senate. Kamala Harris, her motorcade, pulling up. She, of course, is going to be delivering one of the eulogies we will hear later this afternoon. And, of course, we know from Jimmy Carter's grandson that Carter had told him that he wanted to live long enough so that he could cast his vote for her in the last election, a wish he was able to fulfill. And what a remarkable moment that must have been for someone who spent so much of his life fighting for racial justice to have the chance to references and remarks from congressional leaders. Republican leader John Thune of the Senate, House Speaker Mike Johnson will also be speaking. And we have been talking about what an outsider Jimmy Carter was, and that extended as well to his relationship with Congress. They were not necessarily a natural fit, Jimmy Carter and Congress. He had run as an outsider, as we have said. He ran, didn't want to schmooze or go out of his way to curry favor. He wasn't interested in the whining and dining of lawmakers that is part of the Washington game. He wasn't going to play that game, and it meant that there were moments of conflict with members ahead of his time. He did also, of course, create the Departments of Energy and Education. And David, we will hear shortly as the casket arrives here, Secretaries of Treasury, Labor, Health, and Education, those who worked so closely with Jimmy Carter, David.
He did outlive many members of his cabinet. It's been so long since the Carter administration. Mary, thank you for pointing out those who will be here to remember the president. We should mention to those of you at home, because I've asked our control room, how much can we actually hear from the root? Sort of feed of volume, if you will, but I wanted you to hear it for yourself here for a moment. Procession making its way to the Capitol Plaza. The United States Army Man, Inauguration Day in 1977. He was a lifelong Democrat, though he would say through the years that he didn't always completely feel as though he fit in with the liberal end of the party. Wasn't, at least when it came to his politics. Although Mary Bruce makes a very good point here that in recent months he was determined to survive through the election so that he'd have a chance to vote for the first woman of color running for president, Vice President Kamala Harris, there at the funeral on Thursday with every former living president. And as we were saying, Deborah, earlier, former President Jimmy Carter knew well what defeat feels like. He also knew the importance of peaceful transfer of power. He talked in the early years of the Trump presidency about how difficult, how tough the press was on Donald Trump. He felt the wrath of the press himself when he was president, though ultimately he was deeply critical in the end of the Trump administration. There were moments, though, when he tried to reach out to Donald Trump, offer his own thoughts on policy, and did relate to him in those early years about how tough the press was. Now, what we're seeing today with the funeral is what we'll see in the next couple of days, again, with the peaceful transfer of power, these signs that the country can unite behind these common moments of service, dignity and respect.
Who had to navigate that world. I mean, he was a conservative Democrat, and they called them blue dog Democrats back in those days. And he had to deal with people who were racist, even in his own family. But yet he also had a moral sense of what was right. And he knew that, but he knew that you had to sort of almost do a dance. He was not a big activist in civil rights, as we talked about earlier, but he also had the complexity of politics was all about. Jimmy Carter did. He had to live it. He had to deal with it in the South if he was going to win. He knew how to sort of make those deals in a very open way, but also one that suited his conscience. And he was not.
As Deborah points out, not outwardly an activist, but very clearly a politician and an elected president with a plan once he got into the White House. And he did make history with a number of appointments when it came to women and to people of color. And that was part of his legacy, making progress from presidents who had come before him, significant progress in that respect. And until the very end talked about equality, that you can have equality and you can also have a very deep faith.
Indeed, David, appointing more women and people of color, black people, to the bench than any presidents before him combined. And David, as a son of the South, I can recall my parents talking about Jimmy Carter as a person from the South and how he often didn't embrace civil rights in a way that was as robust as some people wanted him to. But they said he spoke. Also, David, a person of deep faith. The family often talked about how even after suffering defeat, that he was gracious and went on to serve and did not slide from the public consciousness, went on to serve in a very meaningful and
today during what is a deeply personal time for the family. But her honesty about how difficult that really was for the family, and we can only imagine when families give it their all in these races for the White House, what it is like, particularly when you're a first-term president hoping to serve a second term. But to see the Carter family behind the hearse here today, returning to Washington, long overdue for a man who really was devoted to his country for many decades beyond the presidency.
That's exactly what they think. And, you know, Kim Fuller, who was just on, Billy Carter's daughter, Jimmy Carter's niece, you know, she's now taking up Jimmy's known in the community. And it was, you know, that town of 573 people, everyone knows everybody there, right? And so you have a new Secret Service agent in town and the phones start ringing, you know? I mean, it's that kind of a small place where everyone knows everyone, including every single one of the Carters who are walking down Pennsylvania Avenue right now. I think they're very grateful that people got it, you know? They thought that people didn't understand their very, very, very bright father. You know, here's a guy who, he was a naval officer. He was a politician. He actually painted. There's something going on with ex-presidents painting.
Yeah, I know. I wonder if we ever compared paintings with former President Bush.
But he painted. I went into his workshop, and then he would sell the paintings and make money to build houses for poorer people. He did, you couldn't do. And he translated that to other people in his family and around the country. And I think that's why, even if, no matter what political party you're from, you kind of admire Rhett, right? I mean, he...
No question. I mean, I think that the tally, the number in the end, because of the years and years of working with Habitat Tool Belt, let alone the homes he helped build all over the country by just being part of that organization, that more than 4,000 homes he was there himself for the building of. And for those who are joining our coverage in progress here, ABC News Live coverage as the nation celebrates Jimmy Carter, Mary Jordan, the family has returned to Washington, the extended Carter family, but Jimmy Carter went home all these years. He lived in Plains, Georgia, in the same home that he and Rosalind had purchased before the presidency, a very 500 people. I mean, that speaks volumes, and it's so unlike, and you know, without casting judgment, it's just so unlike what we see now in this country, to have a first couple return home to a tiny home and to be perfectly happy. And in fact, when they used to travel...
Come out from the wall.
I mean, right up until the end. Right. I think people should know this, that they would stay on that Murphy bed, they'd pull it down and say, look at all the extra room we have in that small little apartment. And I think in these times when people, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, independent in this country, and such a debate over economic hardship and people feeling as though they've been seen or heard, that in walking the walk all these years after they left the presidency, I think that's a lasting that's certainly a lasting lesson for the Carters, Lindsay.
And, you know, you talk about how they went back to this modest home in Plains, Georgia. Prior to going to the White House, early on in their marriage, when they just had the 3 boys at the time, they lived in public housing. And we've talked about the love story between Rosalind and Jimmy Carter. We've talked about a few of the arguments that they had from time to time. Jimmy Carter has said that there was one argument that they had that endured for about 14 years, and that was if they were going to have another child, a 4th child. He wanted to go for a girl for number 4. Rosalind was not so much into that. In the end, when they entered the White House. But we've talked about the press coverage, and he has said that of his 48 months in office, 40 among the lowest, tied actually with Donald Trump after his first term. But Walter Mondale, his vice president, who we're going to hear eulogize Jimmy Carter from the grave, as it were, on Thursday, because his son Ted is going to actually say the words that he had written prior to his death at 93 years old, said that he would add to that, we championed human rights.
Championed human rights. And as we watch the casket carried to the Capitol, Lindsay, one of the things that Jimmy Carter was very proud of was that that administration defined the final year of the presidency, more than the final year, was the Iran hostage crisis, which we talked about earlier with Martha. And things would get shorter and shorter, but he would leave a diary of them and looked at himself in those final hours wondering, again, have I aged this much, or have I just not had sleep in many, many months? Because he was so worried about the Americans being held in Iran. Turning the corner here, approaching the Capitol, and Mary Bruce, the country, I think, hungers, craves for these types of unified moments. There will be Democrats and Republican leaders inside the Capitol honoring a former president.
A moment for the country to come together, David, during these very legacy, both the work he did here in Washington during his 4 years in office, and then, of course, the tremendous work he did around the country and around the globe, and the example he set, I think, for everyone about the power of the post-presidency. David, you can now see here on the east front of the Capitol, you're seeing the beginning of the procession. Washington felt this quiet, in part, of course, due to the snowstorm that we had here yesterday, but it all adds to, I think, the real solemn nature of the day for the country. Carters themselves to share his story, remind everyone of what was important to him, but also along the way in all of these events this week, they're using these events as an opportunity to thank those who worked alongside the family, who served with the former president. And so we are going to see here some of the first people who will be able to pay their respects later today are those who worked with him in the White House and in Congress, David.
Mary, thank you. Let's listen. A deeply moving moment for the country as the 39th president has now returned to Washington one last time. He will be remembered, he'll be honored by Democrats and Republicans just moments from now inside the Capitol. You saw there on the Eastern Front behind Mary Bruce. Members of the family will be the honorary pallbearers. The Carter grandchildren, 11 grandchildren, one of whom is in memoriam. Mary had mentioned earlier that the former president outlived one of his grandchildren. They will be at the base of the Capitol steps. They'll follow the casket up. They'll rejoin the family at the top of the steps. And we've talked so often this afternoon about how little fanfare he asked for.
Where's it go?
And Mark Updegrove, our historian, joining us today. You know, he did leave Ontarian work. He returns a hero.
You're absolutely right, David. This is a man who came to Washington in 1977 with great hope that he would do a landslide, left more or less humiliated, not knowing what he would do with the rest of his life. Really went back to Plains, Georgia, and didn't know what the next chapter of his life would hold. And now he comes back to Washington upon his death triumphantly, with the nation and the world really celebrating this remark, certainly the most consequential and fruitful, for which he would be the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. So this is a triumph for Jimmy Carter and a reflection of his enormous legacy. It's quite remarkable, and he was proud, so proud of the work that he did with the Carter Center, the nonprofit organization that he established in 1982, about a year and a half after leaving the presidency. That's where he found true meaning. That's where he found a way in the post-presidency to do that, leveraging the prestige of the presidency, and I think really reinvented what the post-presidency could be, created a playbook for the activist post-presidency.
Mark, thank you. This has been a long journey back to Washington, his one final trip back to D.C. And as Mark Updegrove, our historian, symbol of this procession today, riderless, of course, the saddle on that horse. A reminder he will not serve again. He did redefine what a post-presidency could be in terms of work for humanity, eradicating disease, for peace. Ultimately did win the Nobel Prize, earned it. The honorary pallbearers will also gather at the steps of the Capitol. They'll rejoin the family at the top of the stairs. Inside the Capitol, the former president, the Lion State House, Mike Johnson, just re-elected Speaker, of course. Senator Thune in the Senate, now the Majority Leader. Minority Leader Schumer will also be there. Vice President Kamala Harris, who Jimmy Carter voted for, and we've talked at length here, Terry, about the deep friendship between President Biden and former President Carter. President Biden and the First Lady traveled to Plains, Georgia, a sitting president and sitting First Lady, the first to do so publicly. And it was President Biden who was the first.
And that, David, bound the two of them in this decades-long friendship, political partnership in some ways. And in some ways, they're cut from the same cloth. They're both men of deep faith, deep and sincere faith that shaped their lives and their presidency. They tried to bring, to one degree of success or another, the President Biden, of course, a Roman Catholic, and they brought that faith to bear on the power that they had been given. Both one-term presidents now, for different reasons, but analogous, both very low in the polls, and yet I think they both, with their presidency, felt they gave it their best. Jimmy Carter, especially after the presidency, as you've been talking about, Jimmy Carter proves him wrong.
Yeah, he might just disagree with that. His whole post-presidency was his second act. And Mark Updegrove, our historian, and so many others have talked about how he has redefined the post-presidency. The question is, will any others follow suit along the way? And we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. Waiting for their father, their grandfather to come home.
Yeah.
For the former president. They began working on them as far back as the mid-1980s, in fact. And despite being a president who, when he arrived in Washington from the South, a relative unknown who would wear sweaters in the White House when it would get chilly, he would say he would not need hail to the chief, even though he'd been a member of the U.S. Navy, had served the country, and certainly was the commander-in-chief, and deserved what is afforded, that he didn't need all of the trappings that come with the presidency. But he did note that in planning this funeral, that it was important that the procession go to the U.S. Navy Memorial that he played such a large role in, that he'd served the U.S. Navy Capitol in many ways, not in defeat as he did when he left, when he had lost to Ronald Reagan, but instead after decades of public service, after trying to find ways to eradicate disease around the world, to build homes for those who could not afford them, for living a life of humility back in purpose. He and Rosalind, and they stood by that purpose until the very end. They had told our Steve Osunsami in their final interview together about the secret to their long life together, and they pointed to one another. One sang about the other. Yeah, he's been pretty good. We've seen so many stories of such deep connection. When a family loses one, often they'll lose the other. Jimmy Carter went into hospice care. He was in hospice care for 2 years, alive as best he could to survive through one more presidential election. Hoping to cast his ballots of the Capitol inside of the Rotunda. Republican leaders will deliver a eulogy as well. Mike Johnson, John Thune. And John Carl, I would think this bipartisan moment would be something that Jimmy Carter would also be proud of, certainly in these very polarizing times.
No doubt about it. You know, Mary Bruce mentioned he wasn't a Democratic insider. He was hard to pin down. He was quite conservative, and he kind of came to Washington similar in a way. This is going to sound strange, but to the way Donald Trump came into Washington as an absolute outsider who began his campaign in a way running against his own party, saying that we needed to get beyond the insiders in both parties. So to be here and to be honored by leading Democrats and leading Republicans is just another measure of how far Jimmy Carter has journeyed since his short 4 years in the White House, nearly a half century.
Well, that's the time when the political lines can be blurred. The parties sometimes can melt a bit if you're delivering a message of being on the outside, that you're going to shake things up in Washington, that it's time that lawmakers in Washington hear, see, feel that.
There really was, and I have to say another thing as I watch this incredible ceremony is I think about the resiliency of Jimmy Carter. We've talked about his humility and continued to push forward. You know, this is a guy that his boyhood home had no electricity, no running water, no heat except what came out of the stove in the kitchen and the open fireplace, and dreamed of getting into the Naval Academy. And as we heard earlier, didn't get in the first time around, tried again, got in. Somebody in a similarly audacious fashion decided to run for governor of Georgia and lost, came back and won. Got elected to the presidency, and in 1984, when Ronald Reagan was reelected, defeating Jimmy Carter's former vice president. And that campaign, in a way, was run against Jimmy Carter again, as Carter said, as Reagan's message was, it's morning in America again. In other words, we don't want to go back to 4 years ago, to what we had under Jimmy Carter. And then he does all he does in his post-presidency. And one of my memories of being with him personally was being actually at a Jimmy Carter press conference, David. Not in the White House, but in almost exactly 10 years ago when he was diagnosed with melanoma that had spread, cancer that had spread to his brain. And it was believed he had him in Atlanta. And I asked him to assess his life, his post-presidency versus the time he spent in the White House. And he doing the humanitarian work that he had done was far more meaningful to him because he had traveled to so many places around the globe and had close personal contact with so many states there in some of the most remote and neediest places on the planet. But he was diagnosed with possibly just having weeks to live, and he lived another decade where he continued that work at the Carter Center, improbably with the experimental treatment. This is somebody who went into hospice 2 years ago. Who lives for 2 years in hospice? He was a deeply ambitious man, miserable, she said of her husband. He's miserable if he is not doing something. It was that constant activity, that constant desire.
And John describes this press conference, Mary, where the former president talks about having brain cancer and quite possibly terminal brain cancer, and offered answers in a very matter-of-fact way. He returned to Sunday school just a couple of days later to continue teaching Sunday school. And I think what John Carl just laid out is something we've been talking about all afternoon here, which is the power of Jimmy Carter's life, the true power, beyond the presidency. The lessons were really taught in the post-presidency. And in a country where people are living longer, we're all watching as family members face health battles, how to do it with dignity and grace and with hope that you're going to get through it and live for many more years, and how to keep relationships alive and to remain devoted to your loved ones and to your family. And in all of those most important of ways, Jimmy Carter taught us.
You're absolutely right. It's so interesting what you just said, because there was this thing about Jimmy Carter that just comforted people. And maybe it was when we all thought he was dying, he was at peace with it. And this guy believes there was just something about the comfort level that he brought in difficult moments. And about 20 years ago, I was with him in Nicaragua. You know, he was always on some mission, either humanitarian or monitoring elections. And he was wearing jeans and kind of said, you know, the president of Nicaragua wants to come and see you. And Rosalind said, you know, you really should dress up a little bit more. And so he borrowed a jacket from somebody. Of course, it didn't really fit. You know, he traveled with a small bag, deeply did love that he got to not just be president, but he got to go to Nicaragua, meet world leaders, help poor people, and then in his last days, tell people about hospice, tell people about his faith, that one of the reasons he was comfortable.
Questions probably by you and other reporters in those final years at those various stages of real health battles, that he was saddened only that he wouldn't be able to see loved ones here, but that he knew there was something beyond. And Steve Osatsami, you reported on Jimmy Carter so many times, so many of these moments where we all collectively sort of took a breath wondering, will this be the final setback? And he came back every single
melanoma that had spread to his brain, and so many of us were, of course, thinking this might be it. His family thought that. This is a man who had brain surgery to Emory University Hospital in Atlanta. We thought, okay, this is the end. There were so many instances, and I want to share sort of an interesting story. You know, these preparations, this state funeral that we're seeing right now, these plans have been in the works for many, many, many years, and they've been adjusted over the years as the Carters have grown older and had different. There were times where we would think that he was sick or hear that he was sick, and he would be hospitalized. There would be rumors of his demise, and then Jimmy Carter, in his way, a week later, would be at a parade, and there would be a picture of him waving to cameras. And fine. Time after time after time, he beat back illness. We were hearing reports that he had an illness recently as in the month of November. And here he was still weeks later in him. And, you know, we've talked about so many families across America having gone through this, my own family, having someone in hospice care. Jimmy Carter held on for a long, long time, and he obviously is a very strong man.
Thank you, Steve. The family is here at the Capitol at the steps. Mary, the family gathering at the top of the steps, the Carter family and some members of the foot as honorary pallbearers to watch their father and grandfather brought to the Capitol one final time.
And I think you'll see some members of Congress who've made the final years, and many people went down to just hang out with him, including Nancy Pelosi, who went down there when she was, you know, in a big, difficult moment in the House when she was the majority leader. She went down, she said to him, I thought I was only going to be here for an hour, but I'm just kind of mesmerized by this place. And she spent time there, and I'm sure you'll be seeing her today and through the funeral on Thursday, too. Many, many people, including some in the Biden administration. The National Security Advisor for Obama, Tom Donilon, was the one who Carter right out of law school. You'll see all of them come out, many of them now lawmakers, senators, members of Congress, cabinet members, high-ranking government officials. A lot of Washington actually, at the time, in '76, in post-Watergate time, I won't tell a lie, you can trust me, it was a campaign.
Inside the Capitol Rotunda, former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi there. Mary Jordan had told us earlier about the former Speaker's travels to Plains, Georgia. Members of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Roberts there, all following the honorary pallbearers into the U.S. Capitol. The procession will move into the Capitol. They're going to pause once they get inside the east doors right there. They are preparing to receive the former president, Senator Elizabeth Warren there, and other members of Congress. Preparing to honor former President Jimmy there. They will hear eulogies from Speaker Johnson, Senate Majority Leader Thune, and from Vice President Kamala Harris, who will honor the 39th President of the United States. As we've mentioned, President Biden will deliver the eulogy at the National Cathedral on Thursday to honor his friend, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter and his race for president.
And in recognition of all his work overseas, I see many, many ambassadors to the United States.
You can see Jean Shaheen there, obviously, Susan Collins, Senator Langford, members of both sides of the aisle, Senator Ossoff, gathered inside the rotunda. Well, their native son.
A son of the South, and quite fitting there, David, too, because you have, as we talked about, the diversity there with those two members there from Georgia, and something that President Carter had really worked hard to see. And to see that happen in the South was something that was not heard of during the time he was governor. So certainly a change.
Speaker Johnson, Majority Leader Thune. We will hear from all of them in what has become these of honoring a life of service.
Boy, that light is spectacular in that room, and you know, just there is some warm feeling. Maybe it's that beautiful light. Maybe it's that there's Republicans and Democrats, and they're not yelling at each other. There's just something very striking about the look and feel of that room right now.
The 39th president, who wasn't always comfortable when he arrived in Washington, working both sides of the aisle, trying to push through his agenda politically, now returns to be honored by both sides of the aisle and both parties in Washington. procession has begun.
Let us pray. Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arms have bound the restless waves, we thank you for the inspiration of James Earl Carter, Jr., the 39th President of the United States. We proclaim your generosity of someone with the ethical congruence to be salt and light to his generation. Lord, he made the integrity, his commitment to leave the world better than he found it, and his exemplary love for his precious. Teach us to know you more clearly, to love you more dearly, and to follow you more nearly each day. We pray in your matchless name.
Very black. You can see the mall there in Washington, snow-covered. Majority Leader Thune with his eulogy.
Madam Vice President, Mr. Speaker, Leader Schumer, Leader Jeffries, Jack, Chip, again, a final farewell to Jimmy Carter. Navy veteran, peanut farmer, Governor of Georgia, and President of the United States. Sunday school teacher, Nobel Prize winner, advocate for peace and human rights. In a commencement speech he delivered at Liberty University back in 2018, President Carter told a story about going on a mission to Massachusetts back in his younger days under the auspices of the Southern Baptist Convention. During that trip, President Carter was impressed by the success of a fellow missionary in winning souls to Christ. And so as the mission was winding down, he asked him what made him so sad. I try to have two loves in my heart. One love is for God, and the other love I have in my heart, Carter said, that he never forgot. And I think it's fair to say that it's also a statement he lived by. President Carter's term as president ended in 1981. And for the remainder of his life, the longest that meant things like the Carter Center, which among other things works for the eradication of disease in some of the poorest areas of the globe. And it meant things like his work with Habitat for Humanity to provide affordable housing for those in need. And when I bring attention to good causes, it's why he encouraged Habitat to make use of his name and image. But simply lending his name, or maybe attending a gala or two, and he did that literally on numerous Habitat builds, including one back in 1994 in Eagle Butte in my home state of South Dakota. Well into his 90s, he could be found with his heart. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And Jimmy Carter did his very best to live according to the calling of his Lord and Savior. Today, I join all Americans in mourning President Carter and remember Rosalind is now before the face of his father.
The new Majority Leader, John Thune, the fixture on Capitol Hill for so many years.
Vice President Harris, members of the Cabinet, Leader Thune, my colleagues in Congress, and my fellow citizens. We meet in this sacred hall of self-government to honor an extraordinary man, a man who modeled the virtues of service and citizenship, as well as any other American. Before us lays a man who now joins their midst as a patriot, a veteran, a humanitarian, and the 39th President of the United States. When Jimmy Carter walked out on the east front of the Capitol and took his, now, to me, as an adult, why he captured everyone's attention. Jimmy Carter was a member of the greatest generation. He lived through the Great Depression. He did that on a farm in rural Georgia. He knew the value of a dollar, and he modeled thrift his entire life. As long as he was in office, he hated government waste. His father, an Army veteran of the World War I era, taught patriotism to his children. And eventually his son, this young man from Plains, followed his father. Lieutenant Carter learned from the legendary Admiral Rickover to always do his best as he served on the first fleet of nuclear submarines. It's telling that today the USS Jimmy Carter, a top secret attack submarine, now roams the ocean. Service, his fight against cancer, and his lasting contributions to his fellow man, willing to roll up his own sleeves to serve and get the job done. We all know about his work with Habitat for Humanity, and that was mentioned. And the origin story goes that it was in Fuller, the founder of the fledgling charity at the time, called President Carter and asked if he wanted to visit a site in Brooklyn during his trip. President Carter agreed, and he found his way down to the Lower East Side. Standing on the roof of a dilapidated building, he looked out on the wealth of Wall Street to the south and to the power of Midtown Manhattan to the north. And then he looked down, and he saw an image he'd never forget. An elderly woman. The Habitat for Humanity worker that was there with him turned to President Carter and said, if there's anything that you can do, we would take it. He said, if the very next day that President Carter called Habitat for Humanity and told them he was going to send some carpenters, all right, and that he himself would be one of them. And thus began his famous tradition of donating 1 week every year to build and restore homes for his fellow Americans. It's remarkable to think that one of the 45 men who has served as president and one of the only 13 who, in the face of illness, President Jimmy Carter brought life-saving medicine. In the face of conflict, he brokered peace. In the face of discrimination, he reminded us that we are all admonition to, quote, live our lives as though Christ were coming this afternoon, and of his amazing personal reflection. Quote, if I have one life and one chance to make it count for something. We all agree that he certainly did. So today in these hallowed halls of our republic,
Speaker Johnson, Vice President Kamala Harris will deliver the eulogy next. Amy Carter there, the daughter of the president, listening on.
Leader Thune, Speaker Johnson, Leader Schumer, Leader Jeffries, members of Congress, and distinguished guests. It is an honor to be with you this afternoon, and to Jack, Chip, Jeff, Amy, and Jason, and all the other members of the Carter family. Being with you today, I'm reminded of the enduring words of a favorite hymn. May the works I have done speak for me. Today we gather to celebrate the life of a man whose works will echo for generations to come. For running water, and served as the 39th President of the United States of America, and lived every day of his long life in service school when Jimmy Carter was elected president. And I vividly recall how my mother admired him, how much she admired his strength of character, his honesty, his integrity, his work ethic of spirit. We have heard much today and in recent days about President Carter's impact in the 4 decades after he left the White House, be a former president, and leaves an extraordinary post-presidential legacy. From founding the public health work in Latin America and Africa, to his tireless advocacy for peace and democracy around the globe. And Jimmy Carter was the president of the United States. Comprehensive energy policy, including providing some of the first federal support for clean energy. He also passed over a dozen major pieces of legislation regarding environmental protection. Beloved redwoods in my home state of California. He was a president who, between the years of 1977, all of his predecessors combined, and appointed 5 times as many women. And in the wake of Watergate, Jimmy Carter passed historic ethics legislation. As president, was also a respected global leader. To be sure, the years of his presidency were not without international crises or challenges. Full diplomatic relations with China, which he would later call one of the most historically significant accomplishments of his presidency.
And his legacy lives on in the Middle East, and Egypt had been at war numerous times. Few thought peace could be achieved between them. Unshakable belief in the power of American diplomacy, he secured the Camp David Accord. And throughout the world, Jimmy Carter elevated the role of human rights in America's that work. Jimmy Carter was a forward-looking president with a vision for the future. Consider his establishment of the Department of Energy in the climate crisis, his creation of FEMA in 1979, which enabled our rebuild and recover, and his founding of the Department of Education later that year, which elevated public education institutions and increased national standards for the education of America's children. And example of a gifted man who also walks with humility, modesty, and grace. Recall the stories from the 1976 campaign about how he slept in the homes of his supporters to share a meal with them at their table. Jimmy and Rosalind rode the bus with the other volunteers. And when the group stopped for the night to stay at a local church, Jimmy and Rosalind gave their private room to a young couple who had put off their honeymoon to join the trip. And with the other volunteers to eradicate the vicious guinea worm disease that once disabled millions of people a year. It was one of the Carter Center's greatest triumphs. And Jimmy Carter, of course, given his nature, Africans who were on the ground doing the work. Throughout his life and career, Jimmy Carter retained a fundamental decency and humility. James Earl Carter Jr. loved our country, left the world better than he found it. And in the end, Jimmy Carter's work and those works speak for him, louder than any, and a beacon for the future. May God bless President Jimmy Carter, and may God bless the United States of America.
Vice President Kamala Harris and her eulogy for former President Jimmy Carter, a nod from
Native country, the land of
An extraordinarily moving service here in the rotunda of the Capitol. You're watching both leaders now of the Senate, John Thune, and of course Chuck Schumer, and the laying of the wreath. Speaker Johnson, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries will then together do the same in a moment of bipartisanship in the Capitol. And then we'll watch the Vice President, Kamala Harris, and Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff do it as well. Statue of Gerald Ford, the man who Jimmy Carter beat for the presidency in 1976. They became very close friends over the years. They were a symbol of bipartisanship moving forward, as they're in the rotunda today as a nod to Jimmy Carter, their friendship, and reaching across the aisle. Johnson, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, together laying a wreath. Again, a moment of solidarity in the nation's capital. And now the final wreath into today's tribute to the former president, Vice President Kamala Harris. The former president eulogized by leaders on both sides of the aisle, and his humility, his modesty, and his grace. That's our coverage of the tribute for today. We'll have the funeral from the National Cathedral on Thursday morning, right here on ABC. Our coverage will continue ABC News Live, abcnews.com. Of course, many of your local news teams are standing by here in the East to begin your local news, and I'll see you for World News Tonight. I'm David Muir from all of us here at ABC News. Good day.